Good afternoon. This is Dr. Romero Salinas at Lincoln University in Missouri, and we are so happy to have this webinar today because, when we don't have a good weather, the forage, the pasture doesn't grow at all, and sometimes we know that there are some good things from the USDA about insurance for the pasture. So we have invited Dr. Ryan Feuz from Utah State University to be talking about this. Even we are working in a project where we are just presenting this tool specifically for Missouri, and also he has information for other states. So please, Dr. Ryan, go ahead, just introduce yourself, please, and start your presentation that we are going to high expectation for that. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to present on this topic today. So my name is Ryan Feuz. I'm an assistant professor at Utah State University in the Applied Economics Department. I consider myself an agriculture economist, do a lot of work in the risk management area, specifically involved with livestock and forage and grazing. So this was a great project to partner with you on, and I'm pleased to be able to now present some of that information to you all. I encourage questions. I look forward to talking about the Pasture, Rangeland, and Forage program. That's the title of the presentation today. Specifically, how we can help manage some of the risk with forage and rangelands. Okay, so the first thing I like to talk about is just thinking about the variability of our precipitation that we're going to get, both within a year and from year to year, the variability. It's astounding to me the change that we've seen in the last year. So I'm out west here in Utah, northern Utah here, where this is almost unprecedented for us, where according to the drought monitor, this is just last week in November 7th, in my region, we're now in no drought. And we live in a desert that is very unheard of. So we're having all kinds of new conversations with our producers concerning rangelands, the strength of our rangelands currently. But what's interesting, so then you look over kind of maybe where some of you are from in Missouri, and we have all kinds of drought going on, anywhere from no levels of drought in the southern portion of the state, all the way into D3, which would be extreme drought in some areas of the state. Okay, and then you take a look back 1 year ago in 2022, and we have an entirely different picture. This is something, so I've been here at Utah State now about 5 years, and this is something that I've been used to talking about in our region of extreme levels of drought. So even just as recently as last year, most of my state was in extreme to severe drought. And this was having a devastating impact, year-over-year compounding impact on the productivity of our forages and rangelands in the region. You look again at Missouri, it's kind of similar situation as current, the difference being that the areas of concentration of drought have shifted. So we zoom in, just do a year-over-year comparison. While there's still a good range of severity of drought within the state, what strikes me is just how much we've shifted of now portions that were almost out of drought a year ago are now in moderate to severe drought, even an extreme level where there was almost none before. So what this demonstrates to me is that our patterns of rainfall are quite variable, and we know that rainfall is correlated, obviously, with our production and the health of our rangelands and our forage production. So what the USDA has done is they've come up with a program, the Pasture, Rangeland, and Forage Insurance Program, based on a rainfall index that's going to help mitigate losses or perceived losses on our rangelands and forages due to a lack of rainfall. So that's the core idea behind this program. Today, my goals are to walk through just how the program works, what we can expect in terms of the actual structure, and then also how we can go about using it to best mitigate the risk of losses due to low precipitation. One more graph that I like. Economists always love graphs. This one I like to refer to it as my stoplight graph. So we got green, yellow, and red. A stoplight graph of the conditions of rangeland. So I put this together the other day for Missouri, just looking at they survey producers and ask about the quality of the rangelands. And so I've combined what producers ranked as good and excellent, and also combine the very poor and poor into the red category, and then the fair. And so this is the percent of their rangeland that they would rank as being in these categories. And what we've seen is just back a year ago in 2022, we had high percentages at 70s and 80% of all rangeland in the state being classified as either good or excellent quality, where we had then that kind of right in the middle as fair. The yellow fluctuates some volatility, but right in that 30 to 60% range. And then we had very poor or poor right down where we'd love to see it at almost 0 to 10%. But then just as we saw that drought kind of set in to your region, we see the inverse effect going on now, where we see the very poor to poor skyrocketing up to that 60 to 70% range. And we've now had the good, excellent down to that 0 to 20% range. So just illustrates to me again the impacts of drought and prolonged drought. So now going into your second year of drought in your region, we see the quality, the degradation of our pastures and rangelands is reflected in what producers are seeing on the ground. So in steps the USDA with the Pasture, Rangeland, and Forage Rainfall Index crop insurance program, where the whole idea is to take precipitation, whether that's in the form of snow, whether that's in rain, or however it comes, and use that as a proxy for production. Okay, so if we see good levels compared to our average rainfall and precipitation, then we expect your productivity to be in that good average range. Whereas when we see years where the rainfall and precipitation is at lower levels than average, we expect your productivity to also be down on the rangelands. Okay, so let's get into the basics of the program, how it actually works. What you're ensuring is not your productivity, the rangeland productivity. So there has been some confusion on that. Is producers will have a year where they'll see their rangelands that they would classify as poor or very poor. They see a real loss, and that has impacts on their bottom line as they now have to go buy alternative feed sources. Okay, so they see that loss. They're expecting to get an indemnity, some type of payment for that loss. But there's times when that's just not going to be the case, because what you're ensuring is local rainfall in quotations, in that we're ensuring rainfall in your region as measured by some weather stations that are going to be a good proximity to your region, but might not be a perfect correlation with the rainfall that you actually receive on your operation. So that's important to point out, that your actual production or your actual rainfall. Producers sometimes will have your own rain gauges on site. They'll say, hey, I got very little rain during this period. Why didn't I get compensated? Well, the fact is that we are ensuring the rainfall for a local region. And so the weather patterns can be such that there's some years where the USDA will have tracked rainfall and say, yeah, they got adequate rainfall, but on your actual site, you're not going to have seen that moisture, and that presents this basis risk problem where you're not really connected with what's being measured. But all in, we do see that it's a good proxy for your local rainfall, your rainfall, and it correlates well with production. So what we say is local, every producer where their land is at, where their forage rangeland that they intend to insure, is going to have a grid number assigned to it. The USDA has put together grids. They're approximately 17 by 17 miles in length and width, and that's going to identify your region. And then the USDA measures the rainfall within that grid, and that's what you're ensuring, is that rainfall level does not fall below the coverage level you select. So a payment is triggered anytime that the rainfall that is measured in that grid for the period you insured falls below the coverage level you've selected. And sign up is December 1st. For any who are familiar with this program or may have used it in the past, this is a semi-recent change within the last few years. It used to be due, or your deadline used to be November 15th. They've backed that up a couple more weeks into the first week, the 1st of December now, where the premiums then are due the following September. Okay. So I've hinted at this a little, but how is the rainfall determined? It's not gauges on your own, at your operation. This is weather stations, NOAA weather stations. They use the 4 closest reporting stations within that grid, that 17 by 17 mile grid. And they're going to track the rainfall for each month, each period. The stations that are closest to the center of the grid, or the furthest away, have the least effect. The ones that are closest get the most effect. Okay, but all 4 stations are used. This is an example of the grids. The USDA, we'll take a look at this tool. This is not the tool that I've developed in conjunction with Dr. Salinas, but this is the USDA's grid location tool. So we ask that all producers interested in this, that's the first step, is to figure out which grid you are in. So it's quite easy to use. You can put in an address, zoom right into where you're at, click, and each of these boxes represent that 17 by 17 mile grid. Click on it and it's going to give you a grid ID, 5-digit number. Okay, so that's the number that you need to go start looking at, well, what does insurance options for my specific grid look like at this time? So as producers, then once they've found their grid, they're interested in making the decision to insure using pasture, rangeland, and forage insurance. They're going to reach out to their insurance provider, a licensed crop insurance agent, and they're going to have several choices or several selections that they need to make. The first is how much to insure, how many acres. Okay, and you can insure as few or as many as you want up until the maximum that you own or operate. Then the next decision is going to be timing. It's required for the program that you select at least 2 2-month intervals. So that's the timing that the rainfall is going to be measured. So the USDA puts those into 2-month intervals. So January, February is one interval. February, March is another. And they require that producers select at least 2 of those intervals to ensure, and they cannot be overlapping, meaning you can't select both January and January, February, and February and March. You'd need to leave a gap so you don't double insure that February period. We'll take a look at that with an example here shortly. The next item that the producer is going to need to select is the coverage level. So this is the trigger point. Okay, so you can select coverage anywhere from 70 to 90%. And that suggests that this is the level of rainfall, average rainfall, that you want to insure. So if the USDA measures rainfall for your grid for the period, the timing periods that you selected, and they said, oh, the rainfall was at 75% of the average for that period, and you had insured above that, say at 80 or 90%, then you're going to receive an indemnity because the level of rainfall measured has fallen below the coverage level that you've selected. The final thing is productivity adjustments. So how do we know what the forage or rangeland, the hay that's coming off of there, is worth? That's up to the USDA has done a study and assigned values to each county, to each grid. So you'll have a county-based value for what the USDA assumes that forage is worth. And then it's up to you to look at that value and determine, do you think yours is worth relatively more or less or the same as that county base value? And then you can adjust that anywhere from up to 150% of that value if you feel your forage is worth more or want additional coverage. So as far as the acres, like I mentioned, you can do as few or as many as you want up until what you've owned or operated. What is eligible? It's quite flexible. This can be both grazing land, hay. Now this is perennial dry land hay, not irrigated. And then also BLM, Forest Service land that you're going to have allotments on, as long as you have you operate those acres and have right to them, then you can go ahead and insure those without actually owning the land. Now in a little more depth into these coverage, the timing intervals, as I mentioned, so these are 2-month periods. They're all throughout the year, anywhere from January, February, all the way to November, December. You have to select at least 2, and you cannot put coverage more than 60% of your coverage, your total acreage, insured in any one interval. Okay. And then coverage levels anywhere from 70 up to 90%. Okay. Higher coverage levels are going to trigger then higher premiums. That's quite intuitive. So now as an example to help illustrate those timing intervals. So we have January through December, and let's say we wanted to put 60% of our coverage then in the March-April interval. We could do that. Then we need to select at least one more 2-month interval to do the additional 40. But that it could be, you could do 20% in another interval and 20% in one more. So you can do more than 2 intervals, but you have to have at least 2, and they cannot overlap. That means you could select March, April, but you could not then select April, May as well, as that would be double dipping in the April month of coverage. So which intervals do we select? That's probably the biggest question, that and coverage level. I get producers that'll ask me, well, okay, I'm interested. It sounds like a great program. What do I do for timing? Which coverage intervals should I select? Which coverage levels? How should I spread my coverage? RMA, they recommend selecting intervals when the precipitation matters the most. Okay, so that's going to be different for different regions, depending on your climate, your type of forage, what varieties are out there. But you know your operation best, and you know when rainfall matters the most to help you have good productivity. So that's sound advice. I have nothing against that advice. But the problem is that sometimes even that is quite variable, and the impacts of rain can be variable depending on year to year variation. Okay, so what we've tried to do is to develop our own tool to help producers get on, make informed decisions, look at historical information for this program and see, well, how would this program have done for my region, my grid, historically under different coverage selections? Once we are able to view this from a kind of an objective stance, I've found that producers are able to make these decisions with a little more direction and clarity. So what I'd like to do is jump on to the tool and demonstrate just how the functionality of the tool works and some of the features that are available within the tool. So the tool is located at www.farmanalysis.usu.edu. Okay, so we can go ahead and go there. Dr. Salinas, is that working for you? Seeing the tool?
Yes, it is.
Perfect. So this is the home page. We have a whole bunch of tools here on this home page. The one that we're interested in today is our Pasture, Rangeland, and Forage insurance tool. So we'll click on that. And then you'll start seeing things that are recognizable, hopefully now, from our discussion, from the presentation. The first thing is got to select where you're at. We have Missouri is the most recent state we've now added to the tool, but we also have Colorado, Idaho, Utah, Wyoming. So we'll go ahead and do an example from Missouri for the presentation today. Then you select which county you're in. We can select anything we want here. I'm going to go with Grundy here. Then a grid. Again, where does this grid come from? Well, that's from the USDA grid identification tool. So this is their tool. You can zoom into anywhere you want within your state. You're going to start seeing those grids. You find your location, click on it. You're going to get that grid number. It's got the county, the state. You go plug that right into our tool then. So once you've got your location plugged in, you need to make those coverage decisions that we talked about. So we've got coverage level, productivity. That's the productivity factor, how much you think your grazing or hayland is worth relative to what the RMA has in for the average value. Then insured acres. So for now, we're just going to leave that all the same. We're going to put in maybe 1,000 acres. We need to select some intervals. What I tell producers to do first is just select any two intervals and any two percentage levels for those intervals. What we need to do is start analyzing the data, looking at the historical levels. And so for that, we can put in anything and make adjustments after we've looked at the data. So I'll first just put in two different intervals here. Split our coverage 50% in the May, June, 50% in the November, December. As soon as you've got it all filled out, we're going to go ahead and hit submit, and that's going to generate then some graphs and tables to help us analyze the historic data. So the first sheet here is going to pop up how it would have done this if you would have selected this coverage level, these coverage intervals last year, how the contract would have performed, this insurance contract. Okay, so it's going to tell you the RMA assigns a value of $59.60 per acre. You selected 90% coverage. That means that you're going to get $1 protection of $53. Total protection, you're multiplying by your 1,000 acres. And then the subsidy level. So that's 51% of the premium that you have to pay is going to be covered by the subsidy. So it's got the total premium, the subsidy, that's 51% of it, and then how much you actually have to be on the hook for the producer side. How much you would have been indemnified last year. Wouldn't have been a great year for these intervals and coverage levels. We wouldn't have been indemnified at all. That means we would be on the hook just to pay for the actual premium, the producer premium. Okay. Payment details then. You've got the two different intervals. Both of them were not being indemnified. That means the rainfall in those intervals last year would have been higher than the 90%. So if the rainfall was higher than 90% of the average, you don't get an indemnity. How would it done in history, though? Over the last 5 years, selecting those options, those coverage levels and intervals, 3 of the 5, it would have been profitable, meaning you would have been indemnified more than you paid in. So it's got the percent of profitable years, average return over 10, and then 20. So in 20, just over half of those years, it would have been profitable. Okay. And then you can see that same breakdown in historical returns. I like to call your attention to the fact that you can turn on and off these different graphs by clicking on them. So we can see the return, the indemnity, the premium. We can see anytime that return, the blue shaded, is above 0, that means you were indemnified, the gray, more than the premium, and you earned a positive return on that contract. So anytime we see that, should be 11 of the 20 years. So how do we know, though, if we could have selected different intervals and the contract would perform better on average? So we want to take a look at historical performance on other intervals. So once you're on this first page, you're going to go to Historical Data tab over here in the left-hand corner of the Policy Options box. When you click on that, you're going to get a whole bunch of new graphical interface to look at that helps us determine when our rainfall patterns, or what are our rainfall patterns for this grid? What are the returns, the premium patterns? Okay, so this first graph is going to show percent of that index. So this is rainfall percent throughout time. Okay, so anytime it's above that 90%, that's where it drew in the line since we said 90% coverage. That's going to show times you would have been indemnified had you selected those months. Anytime it's below, you would have received no indemnity. The next graph is the yearly rainfall patterns. It looks very messy. It can be complicated with all of them displayed, but if you wanted to look just at last year, you can turn everything off. Say, okay, what was the rainfall pattern last year for my grid, for my area? And you can see times when it was above 100%. Okay, so here's the 100%. That would be the baseline. That's average. Anytime you're above that, those months last year, it was above 90 or above 100%, above average. There's no way you're getting indemnified there. Anytime it's below that 90%, if you would have had coverage in those months, that's when you would get an indemnity. Okay, so we're starting to get some information. We can go down to monthly premium rates and see just how expensive the premium varies based on the perceived risk that the USDA sees. So in months where they see that rainfall patterns are such that they're going to be paying out more indemnities, often the RMA will then increase the premium rate for those months. Okay. Monthly indemnity rates, that's showing just how often, what percentage of the time you're getting an indemnity over the last year, last 5 years, 10 years, and 20 years. Okay. And my favorite graph, the one that I like to take producers to right away when helping them decide, well, what would be the right coverage level, coverage intervals, which month should I insure? I go right to this monthly returns rate. I say, okay, well, we could look at the last year. And we would see last year, our return rate, okay, so we want higher return, would have been highest if we insured in September and October, in January and February. Okay, so I could have selected those intervals last month, and that would have been my optimal, making the most return back for the investment in the premium for this insurance product. However, hindsight's 2020. Everyone could look in the past and say, oh, that would have been best. But it feels like a crapshoot at the time where we don't know necessarily where our rainfall patterns will be. Looking at 1 year is a very incomplete picture of what we would expect going forward. And so I like to lengthen that time out. So maybe look at that 20 year. So all 20 years of data within this tool, we're averaging, well, what would the returns be for each month? And we see that shifted some from just last year's patterns, where it says, oh, for this specific grid, it looks like insuring in August, September would provide the highest return, whereas October, November, you would never want to insure that interval for your grid, as it's a low average return over those 20 years. Remember that we need to pick two. So if you were to see two equally high points, those might be where you would want to split your coverage 50-50. Maybe you see three equally high points, and you're going to pick 3 coverage intervals and split it 33% each way. Okay. So for this one, I look and I say, okay, I definitely like August, September. I would say this would be a good month to consider insuring. June, July looks okay. Also January, February. Okay. So then once you've kind of made your decision of, well, let's take a look at how we would have performed historically, selecting those coverage intervals. You can go back up and go back to your policy and put in the new information. It said, okay, I want to look at January, February, and then I also want to look at August, September. Those were those 2 that had the highest average indemnity for over the last 20 years. So let's try those and split our coverage equally 50%. Okay, then we go ahead and update tool. And it's going to spit out some new values for us. Okay. Right. So now we none of this should have changed. This is still just last year. And so this is going to be updated versus, well, how would you have done last year with those coverage intervals? Okay. I like to come down here, look at again, the graph of payouts. We see, okay, we would have had only 1, 2, 3 years where the return would have been below negative. It would have been below 0. Every other year since 2012, if we had selected those coverage intervals, would have paid out more in indemnity than you would have paid in for the producer premium after you've accounted for that subsidy. So this looks pretty good. I mean, it's an average return, 76%, profitable 50% of the time. Some grids are going to be better, some are worse, but this is the power of that tool. So I'd like to go back to the presentation and just think, and well, I just encourage you all, get on the tool, become familiar with it, look at your grid, as we're going to see that not every grid has an equally high probability of consistent positive returns. There's going to be some grids where the weather patterns are such through time that we wouldn't see that. And the other caveat that I put in is that's historical data. It gives us a good understanding of how our policy would perform historically. And it's a good projection of, well, 20 years of data. We don't expect too much change, but there is no sure bet. There's no sure chance that next year our rainfall won't be in a different pattern and we won't have a payout. So this is something that I always tell producers. If you're going to try PRF, always plan on giving it 3 years. Don't sign up 1 year. And so I've had producers say, that first year I just paid my premium, nothing. It was just a waste of my time, waste of my money. Stick with it 3 years. And to demonstrate just the kind of the effects of what we've seen in the PRF program. So this shows that producers value the program. This is number of insured acres. It's just exploded since 2016. We had a little growth up until 2016, and then the program has just exploded nationally. We've seen a lot of increase out here in the West as producers have figured out that because of the subsidy, it's quite affordable. It's a good product to help insure against risk of lost production due to low precipitation. And so we've just seen millions of more acres, where we're now up to almost 300 million acres insured across the country. But there's still plenty of room for growth. The USDA estimates that pastures, rangelands, forages cover about 55% of the US, where that's 2.43 billion acres. So there's still plenty of room for growth. The other interesting fact that helps kind of ease producers' minds of, well, how often is this actually going to be a positive for me? Again, that can be highly dependent on your grid, your region, but nationally, as we look at the total payments, they're paying out millions of dollars every year, the government, in positive returns. So our total premium is in the blue line, the subsidy in the orange line, indemnity in the gray line. But what we really care about, so the combination of those three, we could calculate the total positive or negative, the net return. So that's that yellow. And we see that, again, up until that 2016, it was positive, meaning that on average, the government was paying out more in indemnities than they were receiving in premiums. It was not a large amount, but as the program takes off, as they increased the subsidy, they made some changes to increase the subsidy. We're seeing that the average net return has increased dramatically. And I mean, back in 2022, during that drought period, there was a period of time, that they're paying almost, that's 800 million up to almost, $1 billion of payouts in positive. That's over the cost itself. So it is a program that it's designed to provide risk protection for periods of loss due to rainfall, loss or lower than average rainfall. It's not perfect in terms of it does not correlate 100% with when you actually have losses. But it is, in as much that rainfall is correlated with growth and productivity, then it is able to effectively mitigate risk and decrease your risk exposure from the loss of rainfall. So I really encourage anyone listening, and if you talk to others in your circle, if they have questions about this, I'm very happy to answer questions now and in the future. I can leave my email with Dr. Salinas to post. It's a powerful tool that we've created, and I think can help you make informed coverage decisions. So with that, I'll wrap it up and take any questions.
Anyone that want to have a question may use the chat. But I want to ask Ryan, what about if a producer, probably you went through, but what about if producer has hay production and also grazing? So the pasture, do they make a combination, or they have two insurance for part and part of the land?
Yes, so that's a very great question. I'm not an insurance agent, so I'd consult with your individual insurance agent about specific policy questions. but my understanding is that's completely happens all the time. It would just be two separate contracts for that you would be signing up for. One for hay ground, perennial hay ground, non-irrigated. The other would be for grazing ground. So that it's fine. You can select different coverage levels, different coverage periods, intervals for each of those if you want, or the same. But they would be treated as two separate contracts, all within your umbrella of the PRF insurance.
Okay, now you say what your productivity in your land, in your farm, against the average in the county or whatever. So what's happening if I say, well, I am very good, or what's happening if I say, no, I am not so good? What's happening with the numbers of the profit?
Yep. So that's another great question that probably gets overlooked, I think, a lot in these discussions, is producers don't know what to do with that productivity factor. And so most often they just leave it at 100. Not a bad decision, but there are times when we'd be better served to tweak that number up or down based on, as you said, your own perceived productivity of your rangelands. But also sometimes it can just be used also as a way to enhance coverage. Okay, so there's times when we might increase that productivity factor from 100, say up to 120, 130, and that might not be because you are positive that your hay or your forage land is worth more than the county base value, but that you are wanting to increase your coverage. You're willing to pay for that increased coverage, and if there is a perceived loss due to the lower rainfall, your indemnity is going to be higher. So that comes with an added premium. So that will be reflected in the tool. If you increase your productivity factor, then that first table of results, it's going to show you your premium, and that's going to show that premium goes up. So the cost to you is going up, and whether or not it increases your indemnity is then, again, subject to variability of when the rainfall come on average. So each grid's going to be different that way. But I'd say the best advice typically is not I never encourage producers to try and game the system that way of just trying to tweak it solely for production or for insurance reasons. But as you said, look at that county base value for your grid. That's going to be published there for the RMA. It's also in our tool. Compare that base value with your own perceived level of productivity. Okay, so maybe that is off of rental rates. Well, what could I rent this acre for if I weren't using it myself? The opportunity cost is I could rent this or lease this ground to someone else. What is someone willing to pay? If they're willing to pay more than the county base value, that would be a good indication that your value should be bumped up, your productivity factor.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I think it's very interesting. The idea is how to reduce risk that the farmers have in their production units. So, and if it is available, so the recommendation is for the people just to get in touch with expertise, and thank you for being available. So seems like everybody understood very well. I hope so. So there is no questions, and we are going to have probably here at Lincoln University at Carver Farm one demonstration of this tool, and we are going to promote it through the social media. So thank you so much. Do you want to say something else, Dr. Feuz?
No, I thank you for organizing it, and I appreciate everybody that's joined the presentation today. I've enjoyed the collaboration with your university, and I hope that people benefit from it. And like you said, I appreciate that you're going to have this posted, that it can be shared and viewed at additional times as well.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I just finished to be in Facebook, and thank you for everybody that came here, and thank you, Dr. Right.